A time when an entire nation was at war with itself, when neighbors turned on neighbors and a single whisper could become a death sentence. In this terrifying crucible, a figure emerged, a man who, in his own way, became a tyrant without an army, a judge without a court, and a murderer who killed in the name of God. This is the story of Matthew Hopkins, a man who, with a single chilling title, brought a reign of terror to England. The question is, was he a man of faith, or was he something far more sinister? The year was 1620. In the quiet village of Great Wenham, Suffolk, a child was born into a deeply religious family. Matthew Hopkins, son of a Puritan minister, grew up surrounded by sermons about Satan, damnation, and the eternal battle between good and evil. Every Sunday, young Matthew sat in those wooden church pews, listening to his father's fire and brimstone sermons. That hell was not just a concept, it was a blazing reality. Satan was not a distant fairy tale character. He was an active, dangerous enemy walking among them, constantly seeking souls to corrupt and drag into eternal torment. In the Hopkins household, evil had a face, a name, and a mission. The devil was real, witchcraft was real, and good Christians had a sacred duty to identify and destroy Satan's servants before they could damn entire communities to hell. This wasn't modern religion with gentle messages of love and forgiveness. This was warfare theology, where every day was a battle between righteousness and damnation, where failing to fight evil meant joining it, where mercy towards Satan's followers was itself a sin. But fate had darker plans for this preacher's son. By 1644, England was torn apart by civil war. Brother fought brother, communities were shattered, and fear ruled the land. Over 200,000 people had died in just 2 years of fighting. Entire towns were burned to the ground. The economy was in ruins. Heavy taxes were imposed by both parliamentary and royalist forces to fund their armies. Property was confiscated without warning. Crops rotted in fields because farmers had been forced to join armies or had fled their homes. Disease spread with the moving troops, killing civilians who had nothing to do with the war. Traditional authority had completely broken down. The king's power was challenged. Local magistrates didn't know which side to support. Even the church was split between Anglican loyalists and Puritan revolutionaries. When people didn't know who to trust or what to believe, their minds became fertile ground for the darkest fears. In this chaos, superstition thrived like a deadly plague. When rational explanations failed to make sense of the suffering, people turned to supernatural ones. Your cow died? Witchcraft. Your child fell sick? A curse. Your crops failed? The devil's work. Fear spread faster than any disease from village to village, creating a market for something that had never existed before. Professional witch hunters. People needed someone to blame for their suffering. They needed scapegoats, someone they could point to and say, "There, that's why our world is falling apart." Matthew Hopkins, now a struggling lawyer in his 20s, was watching his own world crumble. His legal practice was failing miserably. Who needed lawyers when the entire legal system was in chaos? Who could pay legal fees when communities were being taxed into poverty to fund the war? Hopkins had been trained to analyze evidence, build cases, and convince people of guilt or innocence. He understood how to manipulate testimony and present compelling arguments. These skills, meant to serve justice, were about to be twisted into something far more sinister. But Hopkins was also raised in strict religious family, raised on sermons about Satan's reality and the duty to fight evil. As he watched his legal career dissolve and his financial situation grow desperate, a terrible idea began forming in his mind. What if the chaos around him wasn't random? What if there really were supernatural forces at work? And more importantly, What if there was money to be made in identifying these forces? Hopkins realized that communities would pay handsomely for someone who could solve their problems, not through slow legal processes, but through quick identification and elimination of the real enemy. His legal training had taught him exactly what evidence people wanted to hear, exactly how to build a case that seemed unshakable. The business opportunity was staggering. Desperate communities willing to pay any price for answers. Terrified populations ready to believe anyone who claimed expertise. And a complete breakdown of normal legal oversight that would allow him to operate with unprecedented freedom. Matthew Hopkins was about to discover the most profitable career of his lifetime. A career built on terror, torture, and death. He saw an opportunity in people's desperation that was too lucrative to ignore. The failed lawyer was about to become England's most successful entrepreneur of fear. But opportunity rarely comes knocking on your door. You have to create it. You have to manufacture it. And sometimes, you have to invent it entirely. It was winter of 1644. Hopkins had moved to the small port town of Manningtree in Essex, renting a modest house on South Street near the Red Lion pub. The town was perfect for his purposes. A tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip spread faster than plague, and where Puritan religious fervor ran deep. Hopkins spent his evenings reading every book he could find about witchcraft, studying the methods, learning the signs, understanding exactly what evidence courts would accept. He wasn't just preparing for a career change. He was studying his target market. But Hopkins needed something more than knowledge. He needed an opportunity. He needed a first case that would establish his credibility and launch his deadly business. And then, fate provided exactly what he was looking for. March 1644, a tailor's wife in Manningtree was struck down by a mysterious unnatural fever. In desperation, the worried husband summoned a female healer from across the River Stour. But instead of providing medicine, this healer made a chilling declaration that your wife had been bewitched. The healer pointed her finger directly at Elizabeth Clark, a one-legged elderly widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town. The perfect target, defenseless, friendless, already viewed with suspicion by neighbors who whispered about her strange, solitary habits. When the gossip about Elizabeth Clark reached his house on South Street, Hopkins' legal mind immediately saw the potential. Here was a vulnerable target, a frightened community, and a perfect test case to establish his new profession.
Together, we could root out this evil.
It is a partnership, then.
But Hopkins was too clever to act alone. He recruited John Stern, a local gentleman with connections to magistrates. Stern would provide the social respectability and legal access that Hopkins needed. Together, they would create the most efficient killing machine in Western history. Now comes the most chilling part of Hopkins's strategy. He manufactured a story. He claimed that while investigating Elizabeth Clark, he had personally witnessed her summoning demons. Hopkins and Stern arrested Elizabeth Clark and began their investigation. For 3 days and nights, they denied her sleep, forcing her to stay awake while watchers observed her every movement. Sleep-deprived, terrified, and broken, the 80-year-old woman finally confessed to everything they wanted to hear. Under torture, Clark didn't just confess to her own supposed witchcraft. She gave Hopkins exactly what he needed: a complete network of alleged conspirators. Anne West and her daughter Rebecca, Anne Leach, Helen Clark, Elizabeth Gooding. Name after name poured from her lips as she desperately tried to end her suffering. 35 women in total. Each name Clark whispered became another arrest warrant, another opportunity for Hopkins to demonstrate his expertise, another fee to be collected from grateful communities. Hopkins had struck gold. One tortured confession had handed him the largest witch hunt in English history. But this wasn't just about finding witches anymore. This was about creating a sustainable business model. Each accused woman would be interrogated using Hopkins' methods. Each would eventually break under torture and provide more names. The cycle would repeat endlessly, spreading like wildfire across East Anglia as communities competed to hire the famous Witchfinder General. His first case was devastatingly successful. Of 36 women accused in Manningtree, 19 were convicted and hanged. The remaining 4 died in prison before trial. Hopkins and Stern were paid handsomely, 20 shillings per town plus expenses. But more importantly, word spread like wildfire. Here was a man who could identify entire networks of witches with supernatural precision. This wasn't justice, this was a business transaction paid for in blood. And Matthew Hopkins had just proven that in a world consumed by fear, there was no limit to how much people would pay for the illusion of safety. Hopkins soon declared himself Witchfinder General, a title never actually granted by Parliament, but one that struck terror into the hearts of common people. Communities across Essex, Suffolk and beyond began sending desperate letters, begging the Witchfinder General to cleanse their towns. He travelled with an entourage that resembled a travelling court of death. By time, Hopkins developed methods that would make even hardened criminals shudder. He employed teams of women called searchers or prickers, who would strip accused women naked and search their bodies for the devil's mark, any birthmark, mole or scar that could be interpreted as proof of Satan's touch. But here's where the horror truly begins. These searchers used retractable or deliberately blunted blades. When they pricked a suspected mark and it didn't bleed, the woman was declared a witch. It was a rigged game where innocence was impossible to prove. His methods became increasingly brutal and sophisticated. Sleep deprivation was his specialty. Suspects were forced to walk continuously for days without rest, because Hopkins claimed that only when exhausted could a witch's demonic familiars be seen by witnesses. But perhaps his most chilling technique was the swimming test. Accused women were bound and thrown into rivers or ponds. If they floated, they were witches, because water, being pure and holy, would reject those who had renounced their baptism. If they sank and drowned, well, at least they died innocent.
The water rejects her, a witch!
In Bury St. Edmunds, Suffolk, Hopkins orchestrated one of history's most horrific mass trials. Over 100 people were accused. In a single day, 18 people were executed, 16 of them women. A second trial saw 70 more convictions. The cost to communities was staggering. The town of Stowmarket paid $23 for Hopkins' services, equivalent to $4,700 today. Special taxes were levied just to afford his investigations. But people paid willingly because the alternative, being accused of protecting witches, was death. Hopkins had turned witch hunting into a profitable industry. But was he truly finding witches, or was he simply manufacturing evidence to justify his fees? Here's where Matthew Hopkins becomes truly mysterious. Historical records show that his victims weren't random. They followed a disturbing pattern. Most were elderly women, widows living alone, the poor and vulnerable, people without powerful family connections to protect them, women whose only crime was being difficult, outspoken, or simply unwanted by their communities. This wasn't random selection, this was calculated hunting. Elizabeth Clark, the 80-year-old one-legged widow who started it all, Anne West and her daughter Rebecca, defenseless women with no male relatives to protect them, poor laborers whose bodies bore scars and marks from years of manual work, marks that Hopkins would claim were devil's signs, where demons fed on their blood. But Hopkins also targeted a very different category of victims, and this reveals his true motives. Respected clergymen, Anglican priests who opposed Puritan ideology. Suddenly, convenient accusations would surface against those priests and would find themselves accused of consorting with Satan. Hopkins was deliberately using witch hysteria to eliminate political and religious opponents. The mystery deepens when we examine his supposed evidence. Hopkins published a book called The Discovery of Witches, where he documented his methods. But modern analysis reveals something chilling. Many of his techniques were designed to produce false confessions from innocent people. The question was, did Matthew Hopkins actually believe in what he was doing? Or was he one of history's most successful serial killers, using religious hysteria as the perfect cover for his crimes? By 1647, even a society gripped by fear began questioning Hopkins's methods. Parliament, initially supportive, started receiving disturbing reports about excessive torture and false accusations.
This is not justice, this is cruelty disguised as faith.
Local magistrates grew uncomfortable with the mounting death toll. Communities that had once welcomed Hopkins now whispered about his true motives. The fees he charged had grown enormous, his methods had become increasingly brutal, and the sheer number of witches he found seemed statistically impossible.
Too many witches! Impossible!
Opposition came from an unexpected source. Other clergymen who argued that Hopkins' methods contradicted Christian principles of mercy and justice. They questioned whether a true servant of God would use such cruel techniques. In August 1647, at just 27 years old, Matthew Hopkins died suddenly. Official records claim tuberculosis was the cause, but dark legends persist to this day. According to folklore, Hopkins was eventually accused of witchcraft himself. The story claims he was subjected to his own water test, bound and thrown into a pond. When he floated, proof of his guilt, he was dragged out and hanged as a witch. There are also some stranger aspects to Hopkins' story that few people know. According to historians, during his reign of terror, several of his own associates died under mysterious circumstances. Were these accidents, diseases, or did Hopkins eliminate anyone who knew too much about his methods? There are also disturbing reports of Hopkins' personal behavior. Witnesses described him as eerily calm during executions, showing no emotion as innocent people died. Some claimed he seemed to take pleasure in others' suffering. Most mysteriously, Hopkins' personal papers disappeared after his death. What happened to his detailed records, his correspondence with officials, the evidence he claimed to have gathered against hundreds of victims? Some historians believe these documents were deliberately destroyed to hide evidence of his corruption. Others suggest they contained secrets too dangerous to preserve, perhaps proof that Hopkins was manufacturing evidence on a massive scale. The question remains, who Matthew Hopkins really was. A deeply religious man who genuinely believed he was saving England from Satan's influence. An opportunistic businessman who discovered that fear was more profitable than any legitimate trade. Or something far more sinister, a calculating psychopath who used religious hysteria to satisfy his desire to kill. In those dark years between 1644 and 1647, Hopkins demonstrated how quickly civilization can crumble when fear overcomes reason, how easily neighbors can turn into executioners, how willingly communities will sacrifice the innocent to feel safe. The Witchfinder General is dead, but the fear he weaponized, the hatred he commercialized, the mob mentality he perfected, these monsters are immortal. They hide in every society, waiting for the right moment to emerge, waiting for someone clever enough, ruthless enough to set them free. Just look around you. Look at your neighbors, your community, your own heart. When fear comes knocking, will you have the courage to stand against it? Or will you, like those terrified villagers of 17th century England, welcome the monster inside? Some lessons from history are too important to forget. Some warnings are too urgent to ignore. The choice, as always, is yours.
If you were captivated by this story, please like this video and share it with others who who love a good mystery. And don't forget to subscribe to Cinematic Dark Tales so you never miss our next video.